you very much. It's nice to see a lot of friends, a lot of teachers, people that I admire on the line. I hope I'm not too redundant in observations that I'll make. I'm speaking from the hall of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is having a pre-summit meeting today on sustainable food systems. So that's the venue. I think the key points to start are, as everybody knows, how urgent the timeline is and how important net zero or net negative emissions are for just about any reasonable prospects for much of humanity in the coming decades. We're already on a trajectory very likely, I would say, to exceed the 1.5 degree C limit. We're at about 1.23 or 1.24 degrees C above pre-industrial, and the increase is somewhere around 0.25 to 0.3 degrees C per decade on the current trajectory. There are lots of tipping points, non-linearities that should be expected. We're probably living through a number of them this summer. So from a policy point of view, I think that even more important than pricing is just regulation. So a quantity system to get us to zero, no new coal, oil, or gas infrastructure. I think carbon capture and storage will play some role, but a modest one. I think we're basically going to zero carbon energy. And fortunately, we have a lot of it at very low cost. And we need to do it decisively. China has committed to net zero by 2060 and should actually achieve that well before 2050. And that is feasible. And I hope that the Chinese colleagues and scholars are looking at accelerated timelines. 2060 just isn't good enough for the world. Even a 50% chance of ending the century below 1.5 degrees C requires basically a net zero by 2050 or earlier. The basic trajectory is pretty clear. Clean power, basically zero carbon power, electrified transport, and green fuel carriers, probably hydrogen being the most important, made by clean electricity. And that can get us to almost complete decarbonization of energy use. We still have lots of land use challenges, which contribute probably about a third of all greenhouse gases, about 20% of CO2, but a lot of methane, a lot of nitrous oxide. And so there's a lot of complex land use change that is needed. I think pricing can play a role, a supportive role. It's got one basic delicate point, which is if you put a tax on carbon emissions right now, you're mainly taxing old capital for a long time. So there's lots of arbitrary and politically dangerous redistribution. What we want to do is tax new decisions, real decisions, and that means phasing in the carbon tax, but basically a regulatory approach, I think, is pretty clear, and the technology pathways are clear. Where does digital fit in all of this? It is our profound ace in the hole, I think, on making a distributed green energy and transport system work. We need smart grids, at least 5G, though we'll be at 6 and 7 and 8G by mid-century. Decarbonization allows for lots of resource saving, for dematerializing lots of production, for allowing us to meet like this. We have saved lots of CO2 emissions, meeting face-to-face on Zoom rather than face-to-face in person. I don't know about you, but I like to teach my courses this way, actually, as a positive. I don't view it as a negative. I view it as a very natural way to teach. You can have students all over the world. You don't have to be in a classroom. You don't have to get in a car to go anywhere. And I think that that is extremely beneficial. Almost every core service, healthcare, education, finance, government service has a very substantial part that can be done digitally. And so I think we'll be moving to that kind of digital world. E-commerce is a lot more efficient potentially than shopping or shopping online, and delivery direct to consumer is potentially a lot more efficient than shopping in central business districts or in shopping centers or in malls. So I think we'll have a lot of saving there. Working from home in general is a terrific thing, or working from anywhere is a terrific thing. And I think we should be aiming for a world that really has very little automobile ownership in the future, and take a lesson from Singapore or Hong Kong, where per capita car ownership in excellent transport systems is a fourth to a tenth of that of the normal development pathway. Will save a lot of development costs and accelerate development by having a digitized mobility as a service rather than automobile ownership in the future, which eats up a tremendous amount of material consumption and is a very, very heavy cost. I think if we think creatively about the digital world, costs come down phenomenally. So development, which is the corner of this project that I'm especially interested in, what poor countries can do. This is a fantastic leapfrog opportunity. You don't need to be near a doctor for at least half of your medical care. You don't need to be near a classroom or a teacher or a tutor for a tremendous amount of education. You don't ever have to see a bank again. You don't ever have to see a government agency again for your licenses, maybe with a few modest exceptions. And you don't ever have to own a car again. So if we think in these terms constructively, there is a tremendous leapfrog opportunity for poor countries in all of this. I'll just end the brief opening remarks by saying that if the US and China would cooperate on this rather than the US trying to make some boneheaded medieval new Cold War with China, we'd actually solve these problems a lot faster. As I get older, I marvel even more at the stupidity of my own country. But basically, we're in a neurotic phase in the United States, so China is the source of all our ills. It's very dangerous. We ought to be cooperating on solving the climate problem, the land use problem, the supply chain problems, and the cybersecurity problems and 5G problems together. We have to actually demilitarize these technologies. This is the biggest problem, which is all of these solutions are, quote, dual use. And once that's your mindset, it's impossible to get the single civilian use from the national security agenda. So we really have to demilitarize this digital technology. We need cyber treaties, and we need a lot of confidence building between the US, China, and the European Union, but especially between the US and China. So I didn't say much about the dual side of things, the pricing and the incentive side. I talked about the primal side of this optimization problem. We need a tremendous saving of resources through digital, but the tools could not be better for that. And I think if we aim strongly for it, we accomplish development objectives as well as sustainability objectives. Neng, back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. The discussant is Professor Sir Chris Pistoridis. Chris is Regius Professor at the London School of Economics. He's a Nobel laureate and also a member of the Academic Committee of Luohan Academy. Chris, please take it away.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you, Jeff, for those remarks. I wasn't sure what Jeff was going to talk about. I knew he wasn't going to have slides, so I decided not to have either. So there's some symmetry.
You probably knew more than I did what I was going to talk about.
Probably, well, I heard you a few times before. I saw that most of the panelists were microeconomists, so I decided to go for macroeconomics more explicitly. And I was toying between two topics. So one was structural change, the structural change required in labor markets for decarbonization, which is the one I suggested to Alon, in fact, that I was going to present, but I decided to go for my other macro topic, which is the role of government to accelerate the path to sustainable growth, partly because there are so many people talked about sustainable growth rather than labor markets. Okay, well, government action is needed, I believe, in the path to sustainable growth because sustainable investments in production methods do not yield sufficient returns to the individual bearing the cost. There is a kind of externality, having the biggest return to society as a whole over long periods of time. Now, climate change or major climate events, in addition, they impact particular sectors of the economy and society and geographic areas that unequally, that's the impact, and very often in unanticipated ways. And in these cases, there are general market failures that do not allow efficient insurance markets against these risks. I mentioned these risks especially because we have to realize that disasters will happen, whether we like it or not, climate disasters. So we have to plan adaptation policies as well as mitigation action. And practically every speaker I heard before was talking about mitigation rather than adaptation. How do we deal with these disasters? So I'll first briefly discuss the things that governments can do to give incentives to individuals and companies to behave in an environmentally sustainable way. And then I look at more direct measures that governments could take, especially in the age of COVID-19, which in fact relate to some remarks that Jeff has. Now, when we look at individuals, at households first, individuals, the key here, I think, that governments should be taking more action is education. Now, how aware are individuals of climate risks, both prevention of greenhouse emissions and risks of disruptions from climate events? Not as aware as they should be, in my view. Modern research in the economics of education, Jim Hetman and friends, shows that the most effective investments in education are the ones that take place very early in life. So I believe that basic environmental instruction should begin with well-organized preschool instruction from age 3 or even earlier, using methods that children of that age can appreciate, just like children learn how to articulate words and sentences and how to play games that teach them about numbers and shapes. They should be taught about avoidance of waste, importance of environmental respect, such as tree planting, looking after plants and animals, and other related instructions. And all this can be done part of play. I don't see much of that happening in schools that I know, in the UK, in Cyprus, where I know the education system, a little bit of beginning in better schools, but there is certainly not enough in that, as research by the education labor economists has shown. It's going to be extremely important for the next generation. Now, governments, of course, have a key role to play here because most schools are state schools and they decide, governments influence, if not decide, the curriculum. And environmental instruction should be part of the curriculum from the start of schooling. With time, such initiatives will result in a population that is aware of sustainability in the same way as they're aware of language, numbers, use of personal computers, and so on. Okay, let me now turn again briefly to companies. Now, modern companies have moved on from the days when the guiding principle was the Friedman Doctrine, which stipulated that the best way a company can serve the interests of society is to maximize the rate of return for its shareholders. A number of people mentioned that, especially Amit Gandhi with respect to Microsoft, Eric Musk in his remarks, and others. Now, it's obviously wrong to believe what Friedman was saying some 30 years ago. Maximizing the rate of return is a short-term objective that ignores the damage that a company's actions can do to its stakeholders and especially to the environment. Even if a company does not do damage, maximizing rate of return will not contribute positively to sustainability. Nowadays, companies state many objectives in their mission statements. These generally cover the environment, the well-being of all their stakeholders, which includes employees, customers, and the local community. But whereas one finds frequent statements that emphasize these objectives, there is no enforcement mechanism of companies that ensures that they actually do it. In fact, what Amit was talking about is precisely the statement that Microsoft was making, but there isn't a legally binding enforcement mechanism. Companies are the product of the law. They are set up by law and they are regulated by law. The law should also test them against their stated social and environmental objectives, I believe. And if they fail these, there should be penalties. A company is penalized if it fails on its pension commitments to its employees, but is not penalized if it fails in its environmental commitments, or at least promises to the local community. I don't think there should be a difference there. I think environmental and carbon commitments given to society as a whole, if you like, should be treated in the same way as those commitments given to individual employees or to its customers. Now, let me turn to a more direct role that governments have and make some remarks about societies who are coming out of COVID-19. Now, governments do have a—
If I may, 2 more minutes, please.
Yeah, sure. Governments do have a direct role to play, both in mitigating climate change by controlling greenhouse emissions, but also in preparing societies to deal with negative impact of climate change, be it fairly predictable events like rising sea levels or unpredictable ones like hurricanes and forest fires. 3 minutes I need. There are many reasons why governments should be ones to take action for sustainability, but the main has a tool. First, the externalities of private action that I mentioned before, that if left alone, people and companies underinvest in both mitigation and adaptation. And second, climate action, especially adaptation projects, have a public good. For example, a project that protects agriculture from climate events or contains a river within its banks are projects that might be expensive to realize, but once they're established, they can be enjoyed by all citizens living in their vicinity. Now, in the current situation of COVID-19 lockdowns, governments are spending large amounts of money to keep their economies afloat during the pandemic. They are planning even more spending to revive economic activity after the pandemic. The European Union, for example, announced enormous amounts of money to help countries come out of the pandemic. It would be a mistake, I believe, to come back after the pandemic and try to pop up ailing companies and subsidize workers to ensure that they take back their old jobs. Coming out of the pandemic will present societies with a unique opportunity to divert investments to environmental sustainability projects, both mitigation and adaptation. There's undoubtedly competition for public funds between mitigation and adaptation, but there are also complementarities. A society might spend more on prevention, in which case it will need less for measures to deal with climate events, or it can spend more on the infrastructure necessary for preparing themselves to deal effectively with climate disasters. This is a social choice, but given the time horizons involved, both should be given priority over other spending as we come out of COVID-19. Given that we know about the long-term impact of greenhouse emissions on climate, the current emphasis of governments, both in Europe and elsewhere, on decarbonization is probably correct. Giving emphasis there, I mean. This, of course, does not mean that there should be no action on adaptation measures. In fact, I think that they have been neglected for too long. For example, developing countries with their large agricultural sectors need more infrastructure and more help for dealing with unexpected one-off events. And given what Jeff said about his location, that's probably what he was talking about to his colleagues earlier on today. Now, another feature about the role of government in the post-COVID economy is the consequence of automation and the interaction between the COVID economy and automation. Automation has been taking place for several years now, beginning in the 1980s with the widespread use of computers and it's continuing now with robotics and artificial intelligence. AI is already helping with climate action, for example, by managing traffic in large cities, but more R&D is needed to yield its full potential. The expectation, however, is that in the post-COVID economy, there will not be enough jobs to bring us quickly back to full employment. And this is where climate action could help, in fact, talking as a labor economist now. Eventually, our economies are sufficiently resilient to bring us to full employment, but the time it takes can be long and the demands on workers can be costly. They will need to transition to new forms of skills and technologies. Automation during COVID is accelerating and is likely to take a lot of jobs away from workers from sectors such as food services and retail. Again, discussion of Jeff making some mention of that. Projects associated with global warming, such as more efficient use of energy in buildings, waste management, renewable energy, are more labor intensive than manufacturing is, or even that many jobs associated with services are. So if governments shift emphasis to environmental projects as we come out of the pandemic, in addition to helping the path to sustainable growth, they also help reduce unemployment. True unemployment is currently higher than recorded because of government measures to support people stay at work, the furlough schemes. But once these measures are scaled down, companies will not be able to keep all their furloughed workers employed, and unemployment will inevitably soar. To conclude, I leave you with the main message that I wanted to convey. Climate action, be it mitigation or adaptation, needs all three actors of society, the public, companies, and governments, to work together. But I believe that governments do have the biggest role to play here, both indirectly through influencing incentives that I mentioned before, through education and company law and in other ways, and directly through their action, especially as we're coming out of COVID-19, where they could also help labor markets adjust to the accelerated automation from COVID and the job loss. Thank you very much.